You know me long enough to realize that I love to use metaphors and stories to illustrate mystical and theological ideas. So a few weeks ago, I used the metaphor of the caterpillar cocooning itself, and disintegrating, literally into a goo, and then releasing imaginal cells that create a brand new form for itself called a butterfly. So today I want to use a different kind of an image, and for me it portends a re-understanding, a re-perspectiving of the times in which we live, not as a death knell to civilization, but as a birthing process for our spirituality. And so about this time last year, I wrote the following blog for Patheos, and it's talking about the times in which we live and just metaphorically about what the invitation for us is. I called it Shell Shock, and I wrote it on November the 16th last year. Section A, the crisis. The little shell-enshrouded chick, wrapped in its supply of food, was very happy until he began to realize that supplies were diminishing rather quickly. Now his laid-back life turned into panic. So he began to gobble up the remaining food as quickly as possible. But he couldn't forestall the inevitable. Eventually, only a single morsel remained. He pecked at it furiously, and suddenly he breached the shell. He hadn't even realized that he was living in a shell. It was his entire world, and now it began to fall apart. Pecking at some remaining tiny mini morsels, he created a larger hole. He stopped pecking and cocked his little head to one side. Strange sounds, which heretofore had been experienced as muffled background clucking, now took on an intriguing clarity, almost like a language. His curiosity overcame his trepidation, and he stuck his head out of the hole. A large eye, topped by a red comb, was looking lovingly at him. Somehow, it felt familiar, so he clambered out of the shell, a little yellow furry fellow. He was fascinated by what he saw. But soon he felt a little cold, so the all-seeing eye with the red comb nudged him under her feathery body. On his way in, he noticed a bunch of other fractured and abandoned shells. Next, he realized that he was part of a family. 5 or 6 other little yellow balls were also sheltering from the cold. Over the course of the next week, he made regular sorties out from under the breast feathers into the vast, wondrous cosmos of the hen enclosure, trying out his eyes and his legs. Section B, the lesson. In old age, he became a philosopher, and he realized 2 things. First, it is our hunger that allows us to break out of the confines of our previous homes and cosmologies. And second, the apparent catastrophes are, in fact, the tools of self-liberation and transformation. What hunger will liberate us now? What crisis will unveil the kingdom of God for our times? That clucking sound you heard, that is the sound of Spirit saying, break free. I've been longing to meet you. Words inspired by God. If I were to give this homily a title, I might call it From the Prison of the Present to the Womb of the Future. And so I want to just exegete that little story I wrote last year a little bit and then proceed. So the chick in the egg can only eat the white. That little chick can't process grains at this stage. If it were given any other food, it couldn't metabolize it. And so it can only eat its own environment. And so it devastates and gobbles up and exhausts its entire environment and food supply until the only thing left is its prison shell. And in desperation, it begins to peck at that until a hole appears that eventually reveals 2 things. A mother hen who will welcome him under her wing, and also a brand new wonderful environment, which is 1 billion times larger and more wonderful than its eggshell prison. I believe that God is the hen mother waiting for us to realize that we have to break out of the womb of identification with 3D reality and re-identify with our divine origin and destination. And Jesus used this very same image actually on his way to Calvary, where he said to the people watching, how often would I have gathered you under my, like a hen gathers the chicks under her wings, and you wouldn't. I wonder if he could say the very same thing about our times and our responses. And so today I want to focus on initially just the problems we faced, but much more importantly, the solutions and the invitations being offered to us. At the end of a homily several weeks ago, I briefly mentioned the great revolutions of the last 500 years, the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, and the informational revolution. Today, I want to expand that. I want to talk about 4 great revolutions in the last 500 years. In that homily as well, I mentioned that I felt there was a need for 3 brand new revolutions. The first one is a new version of monasticism. The second is a rediscovery of mysticism. And the third is the embrace of Mariology and the restoration of the feminine face of God. And so that's the theme I've taken up for the month of November. So this Sunday and next Sunday, with God's help, I develop that theme. And then on the third Sunday, I'll do a recap and open up to Q&A. So I want to point out, obviously, where we've gone astray. But much more importantly, I want to focus on where we need to go. I want to show how the breach of the egg can actually become the embrace of a spirit-filled world, how the prison of the present can become the womb of the future. So let me begin with those 4 revolutions of the last 500 years, and then go on to the revolutions that lie ahead of us. And so very, very briefly, the first of these great revolutions was the scientific revolution. And it began actually with a revolution in astronomy, the notion of heliocentrism rather than geocentrism. And it began with Copernicus in the year 1543, where he began to show that we live, at least in our solar system, is heliocentric, not geocentric. The planets don't revolve around the Earth. Rather, the Earth revolves about the sun, as do all of the other planets. Very, very quickly, this breakthrough led to a great breakthrough in mathematics, in physics, in biology, and in chemistry, which radically transformed our view of society's view of nature and humans and God herself. So it began with Copernicus, 1543. Later then, Descartes, one of the greatest polymaths of all time, would pick up on it, and he'd make the famous statement, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, pointing out the importance of reason, that the very fact that he could reason indicated to him that it was proof that he actually existed. And so his famous statement was the embrace of reason as the kind of the greatest tool for the future. Typically, people claim that the end of the scientific revolution was probably Isaac Newton around the year 1687. And he summed up just beautifully with his 3 laws of motion, for instance, and talking about gravity. But the interesting thing is that all these men, Copernicus, Descartes, Isaac Newton, were all deeply religious men. It's not like they were atheists trying to overthrow God. Every single one of them was a deeply religious figure. So that was the first great revolution. The second great revolution then was the Industrial Revolution, and typically the dates given for that are 1760 to 1840. And just a few exemplars, you had Jamie Watt, this famous Scottish little boy who was watching the kettle boil on his mother's fireplace. You know, they were making tea, and you could see that somehow the lid of the pot was rising constantly and falling back down. And he realized it was being driven by steam. So later, that principle was used to drive trains and even steamships across the ocean. You had guys like Michael Faraday, who invented the electric generator. You had Edison, who created the light bulb. You had Alexander Graham Bell, who invented the telephone. You had Gottlieb Daimler, who invented the first motorcycle. And you had Carl Benz, who invented the first motor car. So that was the second great revolution. The third great revolution is the information revolution. And this is a term that describes the kind of the radical changes wrought by computer technology on the storage of and access to information. And it began in our own lifetimes. We all remember it in the mid-1980s. There's a fourth revolution, however, of which I've just become recently aware. It's called sometimes the fourth industrial revolution, and it happened late, in the 20th century itself. And it has to do with, for instance, artificial intelligence and gene editing and advanced robotics. And these are such that they're actually blurring the distinction between the physical, the digital, and the biological worlds. So we stand at a very difficult, dangerous, and exciting time in our world right now, that there's this actual blur happening between the physical world we live in, the digital world, and the biological worlds. And particularly young people who are addicted, to virtual realities and goggles and computer technology is becoming increasingly difficult for them to actually identify with their biological, their sociological, their psychological, and their spiritual selves. And so the results, obviously, of these four revolutions have been, beneficial and also disastrous. It created extraordinary trade routes where we could have supply chains, all over the world, giving us the goodies from Asia and South America and elsewhere. But there also has led to extraordinary downstream vulnerabilities. And the problem has been that the analysts are only measuring the parameters that show the benefits of these revolutions. And we ignore the sometimes global costs to, for instance, indigenous peoples, to animal species. 13 animal species go extinct every single day, and to our pollinators that give us our crops. The downstream disaster for our air quality, our rivers, our lakes, our oceans, our forests, and our foods. And now we're beginning to realize that the snow in the Antarctic and rain all over the world is now filled with what are called forever chemicals that have been absorbed into the air and come back down as precipitation. And at this stage, there is no way of getting rid of those forever chemicals. And finally, then, in 1815, we had a population of 0.5 billion people, 500 million people. Today, it's 18 billion. So a 16-fold increase in 2 centuries. So there were the revolutions up to now. Now, I want to focus today and next Sunday on the next 3 revolutions. But firstly, I want to show that the stages of this battle between science and the soul, I believe it went through 5 significant stages. The first stage, religion was the basis of science. And so the book of Revelation and the scriptures, for instance, gave us all we needed to know about the world and about creation. We believe that creation happened in 7 distinct days. And we believe that we lived in a geocentric universe. So at this stage of human development, religion is the basis of science, particularly revelation through the scriptures. The second stage, I believe, was that religion began to suppress science. The famous case of Galileo, being locked up for the remainder of his life because the Pope wouldn't look through a telescope. The third stage, I believe, was the separation of religion and science. And this begins famously with Descartes, who posited we need to divide, our examination of reality into 2 distinct groups. There's the physical sciences that can tell us about the physical world, mathematics, mathematical physics, chemistry, etc., astronomy. And then there's the religious world, that only mysticism, theology can contend with. So now you've got a separation of religion and science. At least science isn't being suppressed anymore, but now there's this separation. And then in this, from about 1688 to 1789, to the French Revolution, you have, I'm going to call it the derision of religion by science. It's called the Age of Enlightenment, where they talk about the supremacy of reason. If reason can't get us to a conclusion, then it's an invalid conclusion. So now science is beginning to deride and to sneer at mere religion. And then the 5th stage was the suppression of religion by science. We call it scientific materialism. The difficulty it is for people who are interested in more esoteric scientific pursuits to get grants or tenure or get published in peer-reviewed journals. And so we've gone full tilt at this stage from religion being science to the suppression of religion by science. I pointed out a few weeks ago that I saw the extraordinary value and the kind of the downside of the Protestant Reformation beginning in 1517 with Luther, where he exposed the Vatican corruption, where you could get salvation for money, where if you donated to the renovation of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, you could spring souls out of purgatory or guarantee you got to heaven yourself. So Protestantism kind of created a very important move forward for Christianity. But it made three big mistakes, in my opinion. And that is, it abolished monasticism, it abolished mysticism, and it abolished Mariology, the veneration of Mother Mary and the feminine face of God. And it emphasized what it said, sola scriptura, only the scriptures, with a complete emphasis on reason, that John Smith in the street could take a Bible and read through it and understand precisely what it meant in graphic detail, merely using his own reason. He didn't need to know anything about the literature of the time, or the kind of the sociology of the time, or the theologies of the time in which it was written, or even the political situations out of which it emerged. John Smith could just read the Bible and, using reason, completely understand it. So I claimed at that stage that we needed three great new revolutions. A monastic revolution where we return to a true reverence for the earth and for human labor. A mystical revolution where we once more identify with our soul self, not our ego or our role self. And thirdly, a Mariological revolution, the full integration of the truly feminine in our societies. And so that's by way of introduction. So today then, for the remainder of the homily, I want to focus on monasticism, and then, God willing, next week I'll pick up on mysticism, Mariology. So when I think about the notion of monasticism, I see many, many different varieties of it, some of them very, very ancient. Perhaps the most ancient is the version that we find in India. And there are basically two kinds, you see. There's the hermits who are in solitary seclusion, living in caves in the Himalayas. And then you have the sadhus, who are these kind of wandering mystics, all painted and mostly naked, who are wandering through marketplaces. So you get these two great forms of mysticism still alive and well in India. And they're supported by the notion of the four yogas, four different kinds of yoga. The first one is Jnana Yoga, which is the path of the mind. In Western Christianity, that would be like a Thomas Aquinas, somebody who can use the mind to get to the antechamber of the divine. And then the second form of yoga is Bhakti Yoga, which is devotional yoga, very, very often to a guru of some kind. And the Western version of that might be a kind of a Francis of Assisi, who has a love affair with God. The third great form of yoga is Raja Yoga, which is about the path of meditation. And this might be like Teresa of Avila, a one who meditates so deeply that she experiences union with God. And the fourth great yoga is called Karmic Yoga. It is compassion in action. And the Western kind of exemplar of that might be Mother Teresa, going onto the streets of Calcutta and picking up abandoned babies and loving them. So that's maybe the oldest form of it, in my opinion. Another ancient form would be in ancient Israel, the Essene community. So from the 2nd century BCE until the 1st century CE, a band of Israelites left, particularly Jerusalem, because they felt that the temple had been corrupted and the priests were corrupted. And so they wanted to form a community that would be in total alliance with their understanding of God. So they led a kind of a communal monastic life. Some of them were devoted to celibacy and some were married. So they were living in mixed communities around the Dead Sea, Qumran particularly. And it was there in 1947 that the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, pieces from every single book in the Hebrew scriptures and some extra canonical books as well. So between 1947 and 1952, all of these scrolls were discovered. So that was kind of the Israelite version of monasticism. When I get to the notion of Christian monasticism, I see again several different forms. Some of them have to do with individuals and some have to do with communities. So the founder of the idea of the individual monk was actually Anthony of Egypt. Amazing man, he lived to be 105 years old. He was born in 251 AD and died in 356 AD. And he lived in the desert, literally. So they're called the desert fathers and the desert mothers at some stage. So this is a version of monasticism where people live in total exclusion. They're like the hermits in the Himalayas of India. Then there was a second group who lived as hermits, Monday through Friday, but they were sufficiently close to each other that they could get together on Saturdays and Sundays for liturgies together. And this was founded by another Egyptian called Pachomius, who flourished between 292 AD and 348 AD. So his version was that for most of the week, people were living as individual hermits in their caves, but then they came together for worship and for liturgies on Saturdays and Sundays. And then fast forward about 200 years, and you have the notion of a permanent community living together as a group. And this was founded by Saint Benedict, who flourished between 480 AD and 543 AD. Now, this was a very, very well-organized kind of a group life. And when you look through it, it involved the following kinds of factors. It involved physical labor, it involved education, agriculture, prayer, silence, music, chanting, liturgies. And they honored the cycles of the hours and the cycle of the day and the cycle of the week and the cycle of the month and the cycle of the year. So they're totally clued into nature at every level, literally from agriculture to the calendars. And there was a famous statement that Benedict said one time. He said, laborare est orare. Now it's interesting, you can unpack that two ways. The most obvious one is laborare est orare, to work is to pray. But also you could say prayer is hard work. So you can unpack that two ways. Laborare est orare. To work is to pray, or prayer is actually hard work. It's serious work. Now, these monks in this lifestyle had an extraordinary love of the earth, and they were involved with agriculture and raising livestock. They were also very, very big into education. So there was a scriptorium in every monastery where they copied the ancient documents and copied the scriptures. And they were the ones who started the first great universities in Europe, like the University of Paris. Universities that go back to the 1300s were started by monastic communities. And they used the three great rules that I used when I was in Kenya, when I was starting new communities in Kenya, preaching to people, who were meeting the Bible and Jesus for the very first time. And we're trying to create, Christian communities. And I had three rules in Swahili: kujitegemea, kujitumikia, na kujieneza. Kujitegemea meant self-reliance, no dependence whatsoever on outsiders' finances. And that was absolutely true for the monastic communities. They were totally self-sufficient and self-reliant. The second one was kujitumikia, which in Swahili means self-ministering. Whatever the needs of the community were, the community responded to them. Whether it was food or building or medicine, whatever it was, the community within itself had the people, the ministers, that took care of those. And the last one is kujieneza, which means in Swahili to self-propagation. It means that the community grows. So for the monastic communities, they would spin off, when the community became too big, they would spin off a brand new community. And the new community had to have at least 12 members, and an abbot would be appointed. And then they'd go and they'd create a community elsewhere. Now, it's interesting that coming from Ireland, from a Celtic background, Ireland had these three types of monasticism: the individual who went off on their own, the individuals who lived kind of close by enough that they could do liturgies together, and then the monastic communities where they lived as communities. So, in fact, the Irish Church, up to the year about 1100 of the Common Era, the Irish Church was based not on the Roman system of parishes and dioceses, but around hermits and around abbots. That's how the religion developed. And there was always problems between Rome and the Celts about this arrangement. Rome wanted to create the parish and the diocesan system, and the Celts and the Irish and the Scots particularly, very, very interested in religion and communities based around hermits and abbots. So in fact, actually, the word kill in Gaelic, C-I-L-L, which you find written as K-I-L or K-I-L-L in English, you know, like as in Kilkenny or Killarney, places like that. The word kill in Gaelic can mean either a church or a graveyard. And the reason is this, you know, originally a hermit would find a very remote area, build himself a little hut and live there on his own. But eventually people got to know of the presence of this holy man or this holy woman. And when somebody died, they wanted their dead to be buried near the hermit. And so now the word kill became either a church or a graveyard itself. And I have a very personal kind of connection to that. The church that I was ordained in 1972 is called Killamote. And Killamote is in County Wicklow. And in the penal times when Catholicism was outlawed, it was verboten to build Catholic churches. There was only one exception. If people buried their dead in a particular location, and there were more than 7 dead buried in the same location, they had the right to build a church there. And so the people in that area, Killamote, they went to Daniel O'Connell, who was a famous Irish politician, who he's sometimes called the uncrowned King of Ireland. And he flourished between 1775 and 1847. And a delegation from County Wicklow went and said, we want to build a church, but the local landlord, who's Protestant, won't allow us to build it. So he said, the next 7 people that die in the village, bury them in the place you want to have the church, and then I'll take it up. So maybe 3 or 4 years passed. I know there are 7 bodies built in the same location, and Daniel O'Connell takes it up, and he proves in law that they have the right to build a church. And that was the church I was ordained in 1972. So this was the Celtic version of it. Saint Columba, sometimes called Columkill, in Gaelic, Columkill means the dove of the church. Here you have the word kill again, where he's sometimes called Columba. And so he was a missionary. He founded this famous monastery in Iona in Scotland. And from that place, you know, with him and with his successor Finian and Aidan and Coleman, they basically converted the United Kingdom over the next 150 years, beginning, you know, with an Irish Celtic missionary. And finally, I want to mention Skellig Vihil. Skellig Vihil is a tiny little island about 7 miles off the southwest coast of Ireland. And it's like a jagged tooth sticking up out of the ocean with 2 kinds of broken segments. The highest one is 715 feet. And there was a monastic community living there from the 6th century to the 13th century. 12 monks, and then 1 hermit who was living up at the very top peak. And you can imagine what the weather was like at that level. And then it seems that it had to be abandoned in the 13th century because the polar ice caps were drifting south, and the currents in the Atlantic had changed, and there were horrific hurricanes and storms that forced the monks to come onto the mainland. Now, it was abandoned for hundreds of years. My father, who was an archaeologist, went there in the early 1970s and lived there alone for 3 months. Once a month, food was delivered to him, and he did all the preliminary plans and drawings of the island. And finally, then a professor of archaeology from UC Berkeley came, and they did further research using helicopters, and they produced this book. I don't know if you guys can see it. It's called The Forgotten Hermitage of Skellig Vihil, and there are some photographs of my father in that book. And so I can say that one of my proudest boasts is that my father was the last monk on Skellig. Namaste, my brothers and sisters.